Estongo and hello, I'm Tim Long and this is Unequal Temperament. You just heard the fantastic Martha Redbone singing her song Medicine Man. I love her album, so check it out if you can. This is an unusual episode for us because we're experimenting with doing some more topical conversations, and I'm really excited about tonight. But before we get going, I just want to talk about a couple of terms with this because we're talking about some indigenous rights. Most of us, there are 574, I think at this moment, 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Most of us identify by tribe. So I'm half Muskogee Creek, I'm half Choctaw, and I'm enrolled in the Creek tribe and the Thapako tribal town, which was one of the original confederacies of the Creek tribe. I'm excited about today's show because this has been on my mind for a while, largely because there was a point in my life I didn't know about it, and I'm sort of ashamed that I didn't know about it. Religion is always a loaded topic, and I rarely discuss it. I have many friends and family who are Christians, and it works well for them. In this life, I say use whatever works, as long as it involves promoting kindness and empathy. I grew up in both a Creek and an American Methodist church. My grandfather was a minister in the Indian Methodist Conference. And I'm very grateful for that because it was milder. Well, the Methodism was milder compared to a lot in Oklahoma. Because I didn't want to be gay. Think about it. It was the 80s, Oklahoma, the Bible Belt, AIDS that was just coming around. There was so much negativity about being gay. I didn't want to be gay. It just seemed like too hard. So you go with what you know, as Jerry Blank says. I found a Southern Baptist church when I was 17, and because I was looking for answers. They were very nice to me, but it was really a friendly indoctrination into stringent and very judgmental beliefs. So Christianity did a number on me as a gay man, and believe me, I tried to have God take it from me. And when I was in prayer, I received a message finally, after years of devout study and prayer, that I was okay. This was in the 80s. Society's Christians said otherwise, so I left. Later in life, I became much more conscious of being Native American and what that meant, and I began researching history with the U.S. government. It was much uglier than I had ever been taught in any school. And to this day, I'm shocked that this country lives in a collective denial about how the United States was founded. I know why, though. If our citizens confronted tonight's issue, it would force everyone to completely rethink the identity of America, its goodness, and certainly its exceptionalism. I often talk about transgenerational historical trauma. I've been thinking about transgenerational historical gifts as well. Basically anything that we've inherited, good and bad. And it's not only BIPOC people who inherit beliefs and traits. We all do. I mean, we're indoctrinated into everything by our parents as children, for better or worse, and they have been indoctrinated by their parents and so on. So we all inherit beliefs and actions unless we become conscious of things, put thought into it, and override them. So that's what's led to my interest in the doctrine of discovery. It has a legacy, whether subconscious or not, that has lasted into 2021. And I tell you, I've had incidents happen to me. I'm lucky. I haven't had horrible things happen, just really confusing things happen. I was working at Opera Theater of St. Louis one time, and a patron asked me if I would spread plastic arrowheads with her around her house so that she could tell her grandson, a real Indian, left these arrowheads. When I made my Boston conducting debut in 2003, there was still a law in the books that said it was illegal for Indians to set foot in the city limits of Boston without a chaperone. The most recent one, I was asked to do a concert in about 2 weeks. And I came up with the whole program, chose the participants, and I was going to compose a piece based on the act of smudging. And it's sort of a ceremonial ritual of purification. And I thought, this is perfect. I talked to a local native guy who was going to help me with it. And when it came down to it, I was told that the venue was run by conservative Christians, and they were concerned about having smudging in the building uh, because of its pagan roots, and it's dealing with evil spirits. So they said they were going to take 24 hours, discuss it, and vote on whether I could do this. And I said, I am not going to have conservative Christians voting on my rights. And I pulled out of the concert. And it was a very important thing for me because it really made me think about what I stood for and what I'm going to do here on out. And that is directly connected to the doctrine of discovery. It exists in 2021, and I'm not going to be a part of being stepped on that way. So I just want to go into what the doctrine of discovery is before we invite our guests on. And this is from that great intellectual website, Wikipedia, because I'm that basic. But what I like is that it explains it very clearly, and my guests can correct me if any of this is wrong. So the discovery doctrine, also called doctrine of discovery, is a concept of public international law expounded by the United States Supreme Court in a series of decisions, most notably Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. Chief Justice John Marshall explained and applied the way that colonial powers laid claim to lands belonging to foreign sovereign nations during the Age of Discovery. Under it, title to lands lay with the government whose subjects traveled to and occupied a territory whose inhabitants were not subjects of a European Christian monarch. The doctrine has been primarily used to support decisions in validating or ignoring Aboriginal possession of land in favor of modern colonial imperial governments, such as the 2005 case of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation. In that decision, which went against the Oneida Nation, the decision was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg using the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was promulgated by European monarchies in order to legitimize the colonization of lands outside of Europe. Between the mid-15th century and the mid-20th century, this idea allowed European entities to seize lands inhabited by indigenous peoples under the guise of discovery. Really. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas declared that only non-Christian lands could be colonized under the doctrine of discovery. In 1792, U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson claimed that this European doctrine of discovery was an international law, which was applicable to the new U.S. government as well. The doctrine and its legacy continue to influence American imperialism and treatment of indigenous peoples, and I dare say not just indigenous peoples, but people of color, because it was declared international law, and I mean, that is setting up racism right there. I have a few quotes for you guys as well, and these are from politicians, some who are deceased and some not. And I came to this through our guest's work. So Senator James Harlan of Iowa, wrote, he later became Secretary of the Interior, including over the Indian Affairs. He said, if they refuse to merge into and become part of the superior race, they must necessarily be destroyed. It is a law of humanity. It is a law of humanity. James Doolittle, who was chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, that was 1864, by the way, James Doolittle said, God in his providence is giving this continent to millions of human beings of higher civilization and leading the advanced guard of human and Christian civilization. No mention of Jewish people, Muslims, atheists, Buddhists. Representative Steve King. I think of this Western Hemisphere, all of it, as the domain of, as Churchill described it from this hemisphere, Western Christendom, the foundation of Western civilization, Judeo-Christianity, the values that come from the Old and New Testament, the values that Christopher Columbus brought here across the ocean. Not that he ever made it here. He said this in 2014. Lastly, Rick Santorum. who wrote, "We came here and created a blank slate. We birthed a nation from nothing. I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, there isn't much Native American culture in American culture." This was said last week. And my question is, why isn't CNN speaking up about this? Because they hire him to speak, and that's where he did it. That they need to do something. So as I say, though, with all of this, with everything that we do in life, facing the truth is part of the healing process. And I want to help spread the truth, because that's the only way we can come together, really. So I came across tonight's guest in a book called Speaking of Indigenous Politics. I was reading it last year, and it's called Conversations with Activists, Scholars, and Tribal Leaders by Keholani Kawanui. Our guest tonight is Stephen Newcomb, and Stephen Newcomb is from the Shawnee and Lenape tribes. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Indigenous Law Institute. He is the author of Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, and co-producer of the documentary film The Doctrine of Discovery, Unmasking the Domination Code, directed by Sheldon Wolfchild, who is Dakota. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on the doctrine of discovery, based on the 40 years he has spent investigating and writing about these issues. He has been a tireless advocate for indigenous nations and peoples for decades, and his work has now become a global movement. So, Stephen, welcome to Unequal Temperament, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm such a huge fan now. I'm watching your film and reading more of your writings. And first of all, you're just so intelligent, and it just makes so much sense. And I always tell people when we're talking about issues like this, I get worked up. I get bothered personally, but I also get bothered on the side of logic, because I like knowing facts and just what things really are. And you're so logical with your thoughts. But before we get going further, I just want to say this is something we do on Unequal Temperament on every show. And I urge you all to start doing the same thing. We do land acknowledgments, which puts us in a place of humility and an open place to connect with others. So I'm in Rochester, New York, and I would like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And in my language, I would like to say to them, Modo, for allowing us to be here tonight. And where are you, Stephen?
I'm right now in Long Beach, California, which is traditional territory of the Tongva Nation. And I wanted to acknowledge the Tongva, Chumash, and Hashiman nations in this area of Southern California. And and I also live in Alpine, California. That's where we have a place there on the Kumeyaay Nation territory, the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I prefer nation. I think it's a stronger term than tribe. So when speaking politically, I use that terminology. Yeah.
Yeah, I know there are a lot of different terms for that. And in Canada, they don't use the word tribe either. In Oklahoma, we always did, but they all work for me. I'd say another thing that I love about your writing and your speaking is that I'm a huge etymology fan myself. And I love learning more about etymology, because there are things that are right in front of our eyes that we don't see sometimes. And it's right there in words. And one thing that one of the terms that I loved was your breaking down of the name America. Can you tell us that?
America. America, which is Ame is love. It's a command in Latin, and it means love. And then Rika is riches and wealth. So love, riches, and wealth, which is a formula for greed. The American dream is the dream of riches and wealth through life, liberty, and the pursuit of Indian land, which is where their happiness lies. Yes. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love that quote. I wrote that quote down: life, liberty, and the pursuit of Indian land. I'm so curious, where did you grow up and how did you grow up? Did you grow up traditionally, or did that come later, or? What was it like?
Yeah, no, not at all. Kind of interesting. I was born in Portland, Oregon. My native grandparents, my grandpa Bushyhead Spybuck Newcomb, my grandma Bessie Edmonds Newcomb, they moved out to the Pacific Northwest during the Dust Bowl times, the Dust Bowl years, and in the 1930s. So, I was born in 1955 in Portland, Oregon, and my father's non-native. My mom, obviously Shawnee and Delaware or Lenape, and I really didn't have any upbringing that suggested native ancestry or anything other than my native grandparents being my daycare. My grandma Bessie was my daycare when I was little, and that's how I found out later when I went back to reunite with them in the 1970s, mid 1970s. She told me that I was already reading when I was 4 years old. I was reading to my cousin, but we really didn't talk about that. It wasn't part of our upbringing. Although I did have some sense that we were native, we were Indian, as we called it back then. But I didn't really have a validation of that until my mother mentioned it when I was about 14. And in a moment of anger, she said something about my father and made some comment about our native ancestry. And I was like, whoa, it kind of shook me because I was very upset that, okay, what does that mean? I mean, where's our language? Where's our culture? What does that even mean? How do I come to terms with that information? And so I felt very angry about not having been taught those things. I felt embarrassed. I felt a lot of emotions. And fortunately, when I was 16, I was able to spend time with medicine people, with traditional elders and medicine people from the reservations. And that was my entree into the spiritual universe of native cultures and traditions, a whole different reality system that I experienced through ceremony. And that's when I came to realize that's still existing. So there was nothing really early in my life that prepared me for what came later in the sense of knowing something specific about native language or culture, things like that. But as I became more and more acquainted with native elders and spiritual people, I became very blessed, I'll say it that way, to have so many amazing people cross my path and bring, just such wonderful teachings to my attention.
Clearly. And
including,
did you study?
Including, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish that.
Including my friend Virgil Kilstraight, who you saw depicted in the images, with whom I founded the Indigenous Law Institute in 1992. And Virgil was a traditional headman of the Oglala Lakota Nation, and he was the one that took me under his wing in 1992 when we met in Eugene, Oregon. And we spent more than 25 years working on the issues that we were promoting. So without Virgil, I know I wouldn't be here doing the work that I'm doing or be the person that I am today, because he had such an amazing influence on my life. And he passed to the spirit world in February of 2019. So
not that long ago.
No.
So you and he founded the Indigenous Law Institute, is that right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
Did you study law yourself?
Well, it's funny. I ended up at the University of Oregon and decided to study rhetoric and communication because I thought that would prepare me for law school. And that was my goal, to end up going to law school and advocate for Native nations and so forth, until I took federal Indian law as an undergraduate. And I took that from Charles Wilkinson at the University of Oregon School of Law. I was at the U of O, and got permission as an undergraduate to take a law course from him. But when I came across Johnson versus McIntosh, which is the case from 1823 that expresses the doctrine of Christian discovery and so forth, I was so shocked by that decision. I thought, if you have to agree to this decision as a legal precedent, in order to practice law, there's no way in the world I'm going to stick my head in that noose. Now, interestingly, when I was quite young, prior to that, I guess I was about 17 or so, 17 or 18, when I came across Vine Deloria's book, God is Red. And that's when I first found out about the Vatican Papal Bull of 1493. And when I read Johnson versus McIntosh, I noticed that the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall, in writing the decision, had placed italics on the words Christian people and made a distinction between that and natives who were heathens. So to me, that made my mind think of the Vatican Papal Bull I had read about in Vine Deloria's book. And I knew there had to be a connection, but I didn't know what the connection would be. So what I ended up doing is I left college, I left university life for a number of reasons, and became a self-taught person. I used the skills that I had learned in rhetoric and communication and did my own research over the next decade. And everything I could find out about the time frames and information about federal Indian law and history and theology and philosophy and so forth. And then I put that together in my own framework and my own unique framework. And then in 1992, when I met Virgil Killstraight, that I had thought of the idea that we should go to the Pope John Paul II, and formally call upon him to revoke the Inter Cetera Papal Bull of May 4th, 1493, because the following year would be the 500th anniversary, 500th year since that document had been issued. And that's where we began. So when sure.
So was 1823 the first time that the words doctrine of discovery were used? Or did
in
later?
The decision came later, somewhat later, because it was called the right of discovery. Marshall uses the phrase the right of discovery.
Yeah. And so can you just tell us a little bit more about the Papal Bulls of 1493 and what they say? And correct me if my intro was wrong in any way, by the way.
Well, the only thing, there was a phrase in the terminology that you read there from Wikipedia that referred to the European doctrine. So it's when people take what I'll explain in a moment, which is the context of Christendom, the Christian empire, the militaristic aspect of Christianity and the expansion of the Catholic Church to other parts of the world, and they take that Christian identifier and they change it to European. They not only shift out of that context, but they reframe it in terms of a secular concept of a geographical location called Europe and European as an adjective.
That's a great point.
So they're doing damage to,
You said something similar about the word, somebody calling it racist as well, right? Because that takes away from its origins of Christianity.
Nick Estes wrote an excellent piece in The Guardian about the Rick Santorum comment, except for he's talking about a papal bull as being racialized. Race wasn't even really a concept at that time. It was all about whether you were Christian or non-Christian. It was being Christian or heathen, pagan, infidel, those adjectives. So going back to making the emphasis on that point, going back to the question about the papal bulls, there's a whole series of papal bulls from 1452, 1455, 1456, 1481, 1493, 1506, and 1514. And we take the earliest one, 1452, 1452, it's called the Dum Diversus. And it's repeated over and over again, the language I'm about to quote, because the Pope at that time, Pope Nicholas V, instructs the King of Portugal, King Alfonso, to go to the western coast of Africa and to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and to take away all their possessions and property. So when you think very deeply on that vocabulary, you can see that it's very most definitely a vocabulary of domination and a
Yes.
resulting dehumanization. Now remember that that is repeated, that language is repeated over and over and over again until 1493, and then you have 4 of those documents published that year by the Vatican. All right? And in the May 3rd, 1493 document, the Latin language, I found the needle in the haystack. I found a couple of them. The Latin language, which says, que sub actuali, dominio temporali, alicorum dominorum Christianorum constitute non essent. And what that means is lands that are not constituted or established under the domination of any Christian dominators. Dominio is domination, and dominorum Christianorum is Christian dominators. So what that means is that the intention that they had when they set sail was to establish their domination wherever it did not exist. And they had to, first of all, discover, quote unquote, discover, meaning identify the geographical locations of the globe that were not yet under their system of domination. And that's a whole different framing of history and our understanding. It's really not about discovery at all, except to the extent that they don't know about certain parts of the world where their domination is going to be established. And so as soon as they get to any place that they did not previously know of, then they take their mental world with them, and their mental world of domination. And so their ideas and their language system, that's what they're imposing on everyone and everything. And they do that by starting with the premise that everyone and everything that they come into contact with, that they're the superior genius, as Chief Justice John Marshall says, and that they therefore have a right of domination over everyone and everything.
And that still exists today. I mean, we see
it
everywhere.
That is the basis of federal Indian law.
Exactly. And so the basis of so much racism, too. It's built in racism, even though, like, as you said, it came from Christianity. But before we get going any further, I would like to, Rome, play this media clip we have of Stephen's documentary film, The Doctrine of Discovery, Unmasking the Domination Code, so we can just get a little more visual context with this as well.
Yeah,
so Rome,
directed by Sheldon Wolfchild.
The story of the doctrine of Christian discovery is a story of the doctrine of Christian domination and dehumanization. That doctrine is found in documents issued by popes in the Vatican during the 15th century, which declared war on the non-Christian world and instructed Christians to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce them to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. If that's part of the Christian message, and by us speaking against that somehow makes us anti-Christ because we're against the domination and dehumanization system, then what does that say about Christianity? But if the domination and dehumanization system is not something that Christians and other people believe in or subscribe to, then they should join us in working to abolish and disestablish the system that has resulted in the dehumanization of original nations and peoples throughout the planet and continues to do so to this day. Indians of the Americas was published by John Collier in 1947. Collier was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1933 to 1945. Chapter 1 is The American Indian and the Long Hope, and it opens like this. They had what the world has lost. They have it now. What the world has lost, the world must have again, lest it die. Not many years are left to have or have not, to recapture the lost ingredient. What in our human world is this power to live? It is the ancient lost reverence and passion for human personality, joined with the ancient lost reverence and passion for the earth and its web of life. This indivisible reverence and passion is what the American Indians almost universally had, and representative groups of them have it still. They had and have this power for living, which our modern world has lost. as worldview and self-view, as tradition and institution. By virtue of this power, the densely populated Inca state, by universal agreement among its people, made the conservation and increase of the earth's resources its fundamental national policy. Never before, never since, has a nation done what the Inca state did. If our modern world should be able to capture this power, the Earth's natural resources and web of life would not be irrevocably wasted within the 20th century, which is the prospect now. True democracy, founded in neighborhoods and reaching over the world, would become the realized heaven on earth, and living peace, not just an interlude between wars, would be born and would last through ages.
We invite you to support us in ending the domination system. Revoke the papal bulls. All our relations.
I've learned so much from your film and from reading your writings. One fact I want to point out, in David Stennard's book, American Holocaust, he wrote that post-Columbus, there was a 95% decrease in native population. Like only 1 in 20 native people survived post-Columbus. So, I mean, there were concerted efforts to rid the planet of us. And I don't know, it's just really startling. So tell me, why is this not discussed? That's what baffles me so much.
Well, let me back up just a bit and acknowledge Sheldon Wolfchild, the director of the movie. And without Sheldon, the movie wouldn't exist. It is based on my book, so it's a collaborative effort between us. Mm-hmm. And acknowledge Buffy St. Marie as a contributor to the movie and her narration and so forth. The question of why, and then also Dr. Luis Rivera-Pagan, a theologian that appears in the movie. Why is it not discussed? Well, it's becoming more discussed lately, but it has to do with the unwillingness, I believe, of the U.S. government and of the people of the United States to really deal with the foundational premise of its system. And what I find puzzling is the fact that so many federal Indian law attorneys seem unwilling to delve into the foundation of the framework that they're operating within. And if you think about it, most attorneys it's their job to be concerned with their clients' interests, to make the arguments that will win the day. It's not their job. They're not paid to go and do a historical retrospective into the various cases and the nuances of argument and the details about the papal bulls and so forth and so on. So my friend Peter Dorico and I, Peter Dorico he has a Yale Law degree and taught legal studies at University of Massachusetts at Amherst for about 30 years. And he and I have been having a 30-year conversation about all this. And what makes it unique for us is that we have a very philosophical orientation. So we want to know, what does the historical record tell us? What do these old documents tell us? I mean, it's this deep, deep hunger for information, this curiosity, a burning sense of desire to understand what really happened. What does it mean to say that 95% of the people were wiped out throughout the hemisphere? What does that really mean in terms of our experiences, the intergenerational trauma that you mentioned, the languages, cultures, spiritual traditions, the thousands and thousands of years of evolution of language and culture and spirituality? What does that mean for that to be, so much of that to be wiped out through just the attrition of disease, but also the genocidal agenda of the colonizers to come in and say, you're not worth anything. We don't care if you live or die. In fact, we would prefer that you're not even here. And if you are here, we want you to just be a mere reflection of who we are. So you'll be brown, white men running around, or women running around with no understanding of your language, culture, and spiritual traditions. And that serves them very well, because then they have the land, they have the resources, they have everything they can obtain that satisfies their desire for riches and wealth and the power that goes with that. So it really cuts at the very foundational question about the nature of the United States and what the United States actually is as a political experiment,
Yes.
rather than the mythology of what it is or what it has purported to be.
And it is a huge mythology, isn't it? I mean, and people will fight and die for that mythology. I have to say very quickly that anybody listening, you can write in with questions to our producer, Emily Aka. You see it screening occasionally down there. We're going to have a question and answer session very soon. So if you want to ask something, please write in, or you can simply say hello. And also a reminder to please subscribe to this podcast so we can continue having important talks like this. And you did say, I know I've sort of absorbed so much, I don't want to confuse anything, but I think you mentioned that one of the issues is that in order for this precedent to be revoked, the 1823 decision, it would require a court case that is similar to that, where the court could address the case. Is that right? And that doesn't come up very often, or it doesn't?
Well, if you, it doesn't come up very often. I mean, that gets into probably a lot more of a detailed discussion than we need to go into at the moment. But I will say that the more important agenda item at the moment is to help people to really understand what it is, first of all. In order to deal with the problem effectively, you have to diagnose what the nature of the problem is and really understand it, okay? And so much of this has to do with cognition. It has to do with attitudes, values, and beliefs. It has to do with assumptions about what is real that are erroneous assumptions about what is real. But because so many people hold them, if millions of people hold an erroneous assumption and believed it to be true rather than erroneous, then it becomes true for them because of their mutually shared commitment to that. And so that is part of what we're dealing with. And so whether we're going to get the specific case to the Supreme Court and challenge it, I will say that Chairman Joe De Gaudy of the Yakama Nation, while he was there as chairman, he's now no longer in that position, but while he was able to educate his attorneys, the attorneys of the Yakama Nation, and the whole entire council supported submitting a legal brief to the U.S. Supreme Court formally, officially, in the Cougar Den case, which is a taxation case having to do with their treaty rights for trade and travel, free trade and travel. And they submitted a direct challenge to the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination, using that terminology in their legal brief, their amicus brief, a friend of the court brief. It's the first time in history that was ever submitted, that kind of a brief was ever submitted to the Supreme Court. So now they know, because there were, I think, 2 references to that in the decision, 2 or 3 references to the amicus brief in the final decision. So what that means then is that they're fully aware, they've been put on notice that using this framework, using my information, that we're onto them.
What year was that?
Decision was like 2004. What time? What 2018. It was submitted 2018. The decision was 2019. Yeah.
I'm still shocked that in 2005 Ruth Bader Ginsburg used it in a decision. Yeah. I mean, in the 21st century, it's all very shocking. And it seems like one of the disconnects is that they go back to 1823 with that decision, but they don't connect it to the doctrine. Well, the papal bulls was basically your mission, right?
Right. See, Chief Justice John Marshall and Joseph Story, who was also on the Supreme Court at the time of the Johnson ruling, they were best friends. And a decade after the Johnson ruling, Story published his book, Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. And in that book, he recounts the colonization of North America. He looks into the claim of English title to the North American continent. And eventually he's really paraphrasing the Johnson ruling is what he's doing. And he eventually mentions the papal bull, and he quotes Latin language from the papal bull of May 4th, 1493. And the Latin language says, Ac barbarae nationes deprimantur, and barbarous nations be reduced, or also translated as subjugated. Then he makes a direct connection between that language that he's just quoted from the papal bull to 22 words that are found in the Johnson ruling. And he says this principle then, referring back to the language of the papal bull, that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments once being established. Well, if you take those 22 words, those are directly verbatim from the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling. So he, as a member of the Supreme Court, has made a direct connection between 22 words from the main principle of discovery in the Johnson ruling and the language in the papal bull saying, and barbarous nations be reduced or dominated, subjugated.
Wow.
That's the
amazing.
evidence. Now, here's the thing. He did not put quotation marks on those 22 words. He did not put a reference. He did not put a footnote. The only way I found that was I obsessed over that page for so long, and I read the Johnson ruling so many times, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, to the point of obsession. And one day I just happened to have the page from Story, and I was making a phone call, and I tossed the page down, and I'm looking at the page as I'm waiting for the call to go through or not, and my eyes dropped onto those 22 words, and I realized, oh my gosh, those are the same words of the principle of discovery from the Johnson ruling, and here he's connecting it to the papal bull.
Would it have been common for him to know the papal bulls in 1823?
Well, yeah. See, those guys were doing the retrospective. They were looking back at all those ancient documents. They were trying to come to terms with that. But these were the most elite of the elite of the elite of the intellectuals of that time.
Yes.
Joseph Story, Henry Wheaton, John Marshall. So we have to match them in going back and doing the retrospective to go through the whole historical record and understand what they did and how Harvard and Yale and Columbia University, those intellectuals were passing this off from one generation to the next until it got to Vine Deloria Jr. in the 1960s. He was studying theology, and he was starting to put the pieces together, and he came across William Washburn's book, Red Man's Land, White Man's Law. And William Washburn cited to the Vatican Papal Bull of May 4th, 1493 in that book, and Vine Deloria cited to that book. I think that book came out in 72, and I think Deloria's book came out in 74. But he was putting the pieces together. In 1962, he was already onto it, actually. So, a decade earlier, while he was studying theology, he wrote an open letter to the Christian leaders of the world, identifying the Christian doctrine of discovery. We quote from that at the end of the movie. Mm-hmm. But all that time, nobody really followed up on that.
That's incredible. It really is incredible. And can you quickly tell us about? I'm sorry, it has to be quick. I feel like I'm talking for hours, but yeah. Can you tell us just a tidbit of your visit to the Vatican?
Well, I've had a couple. One in 2000, that was interesting. I walked a copy of the Papal Bull up the steps to the Swiss Guard at dusk and gave it back to him. I felt I was sort of like the boomerang of bad magic somebody's using. So this was coming back to them. And so I delivered this to the Swiss Guard and made a statement, which I thought was something of a profound statement about the subjugation of indigenous nations and peoples throughout the world. And he looked at it and he looked at me and he said, "You got an envelope?" It was completely lost on the man. He didn't know what I was talking about. But I did get to meet the Pope in 2016 and give him a copy of my book. We met, a number of us met with the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. Archbishop Silvano Tomasi, and there was a delegation called the Long March to Rome that ended up there, and Joe De Gaudi, myself, Loretta Frederik, a whole bunch of people were there. And so we had a long discussion with the Vatican, but what they've been doing is sidestepping the whole issue. They've been sidestepping the whole issue. Well, because it has such profound, it has profound implications for the real nature of the church. You have to understand,
like
their
identity.
Yes, and so this is much longer than we can deal with in one podcast. But let me mention a couple other sentences from the Papal Bull. One in particular states, "We have confidence or trust in Him," capital H on Him. So that's talking about their deity. All right, "from whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed." From whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed. That's acknowledging that empires and dominations are coming out of their deity, proceeding forth from their deity, and all the good things that come from empire and domination. I don't know of anyone else who ever found that language and pinpointed it and looked at it. And when I pointed this out to the Vatican nuncio, to the ambassador of the Vatican, back in 2010, and I asked him about it. I didn't really know he was the new ambassador, but anyway, I was having a conversation with him. And when I said him, he said, "That's Jesus Christ or God." And then I continued and I said, "From whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed." So if the empires and dominations are coming out of Him, who is Jesus Christ or God, does that mean it's a God of domination? And he said, "Well, everything comes from the God, the birds and the trees." And what was your name again?
I just want to read another. I don't know. I've written down so many quotes of yours and facts because it sickens me. 1862, Minnesota, Dakota mass execution. The Sioux land wars resulted in the massacre at Wounded Knee, which was the culmination of Manifest Destiny. And U.S. soldiers got medals of honor for this massacre of indigenous people. And there are still ongoing efforts to have those medals rescinded.
Right. That's happening right now. Well, let me say one thing, Tim, which is, because we'll be wrapping up here, and I want to make the point that this is not, for me, it's not about bashing Christianity or Christians or what have you. What it's about is examining accurately the historical record and what it reveals. Yes. But also looking at the patterns, processing enough data, enough information to recognize the patterns. And what I have identified are patterns of domination and dehumanization that serve as the foundation of what's called world civilization. World civilization, the definition of that word civilization in that context is this. It's in Webster's Third New International Dictionary. The forcing of a cultural pattern on a population to which it is foreign. That forcing, we have to have a view from the shore looking out at the ship coming toward shore, the colonizers coming toward shore. We don't want to be on the ship coming toward our own ancestors and our understanding of history.
Yes.
So when we're on the shore, that civilizing, the forcing of a cultural pattern on another nation or people is us. We're the ones that is being forced upon our ancestors. Okay, so that's a process of domination. The end result of that is the domination that results from patterns of domination being exerted over ever larger geographical areas. So that's called progress. Progress is the extent to which domination has been extended over greater and greater areas of the earth. So world civilization is really world domination from our perspective. All right? Civilization, state, the nature of sovereignty, ascendancy, dominion, property, and empire. Those are 7 terms of domination. If you took a whiteboard and you put examples of domination and dehumanization at the top as the category, and put everything under that category that you could think of that was an example of domination and dehumanization, how much of the economic system of the planet would be implicated? How many of the social ills and the economic ills and so forth, all the poverty and yet you have this other part of the society globally that's on top on these Himalayan size amounts of wealth and accumulated wealth and so forth, and they're not in the same league in terms of a human existence, quote unquote. And if we had time, I could even get into the way in which the word human has not really been understood, because there's a Supreme Court of California decision called City of San Diego versus Cuyamaca Water Company. And what the Supreme Court of California said in that decision is that the only thing existing in California before the Spaniards arrived was a state of barbarism. Now, remember, I mentioned the papal bull, Ac Barbari Nationis Deprimantur. Barbari goes with barbarism. Now, if they're not human because they're barbarous and they're in a state of barbarism, then by what means would they become human? By being forced to build their own prison in the form of a mission, by being forced to toil and labor in enslavement under the lash of the soldiers and the priests, and then also being baptized having water sprinkled on them in a ceremony they have no understanding of whatsoever. And once they've been established under that domination system of abuse and oppression, then they're on the road to becoming human.
Yeah, so you wrote something which I loved, and we can't really go into it now. We'll have you back. Believe me, we'll have you back, and we'll talk about more. But one thing that I loved was how you said when explorers landed, they basically baptized the land with the sword.
Yes.
And then baptized the indigenous people with Christian names. And we look at our names, and it makes me want to go back to original names too. But before we get going on further, I would like to bring our producer, Emily, on, if she's there, to see if we have any audience questions on this very interesting evening. Emily, are you there? There you are.
Hello.
Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Take it away.
Yes, I have so many questions, actually. So the first one is from Christopher. And it's, do you think, Stephen, that the papal bulls of the 15th century grow out of the Crusades?
Yeah, the first crusade was declared in 1095, and there was a understanding that when they attacked Jerusalem, that whatever the Christians were able to take by force, that they would, I cover this in my book, that they had a right to that because they had been able to wrest it or wrench it away from the Muslims. And because the goal was to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims, all right? And so it was the idea of the pattern of the doctrine of domination, that they would invade and capture, and then whatever they captured, they were able to possess, and then they considered that to be their property. So they methodically went through and killed as many Muslims as possible as a result of that doctrine. So that's the precursor to what we later see in the 15th century. And the same pattern is playing out.
Nothing new under the sun. Here's a shift in conversation topic. You mentioned that you've been having a 30-year philosophical friendly conversation. And, one of our goals at Unequal Temperament is to foster friendly philosophical conversation. So 30 years that's a beautiful accomplishment. Do you have any tips for people who want to foster this in their own life?
Gosh, I don't know. We were just having a conversation again today, Peter and I, and it's kind of extraordinary, actually. I think just having really solid friendships where you can I call us intellectual running partners, because I used to be a runner, And if once you're really in shape, you can have a great run, maybe 10-mile run, and have a conversation along the way. It's not that big a deal to run 10 miles. So, but at the same time, we're matched, we're very well paired, and we're learning from each other. And it's kind of a dance in a sense also, where we're just having this great synergistic effect of all the information that we've gathered and the conversations we've had that build on the last conversation, and just accumulates. And it's just quite extraordinary. But I also have the same type of relationship with my wife, Paige. You know, we've been together 38 years, May 12th. And she's an extraordinary person as well, and just an amazing brain, an amazing energy. And so I think that if you're fortunate enough, you will find the people that come into your life that you can have those kinds of deep bondings with. And of course, I'm also working with my daughter, Shauna Blue Star Newcomb, now as well. And she has her own unique and beautiful way of expressing herself with regard to these issues.
I listened to her speaking last night. She was beautiful. I loved it. So
thank you.
Tell her that, please.
The reverence code, yes.
Good job parenting.
Well, it's in spite of me, not because of me.
I highly doubt that.
Me too. You mentioned as part of your journey that you spent 10 years gathering information and building towards writing this book. Is that something that you set out, like having this clear vision of, oh, I'm writing a book, or is that something that just unveiled itself over time?
Yeah, it's kind of like working on the real life Da Vinci Code in a sense. I didn't have any real understanding of what was evolving or what was developing. And it just, over time, it just developed. It became clearer and clearer. But, you know, in 1993, I published my first law review article at New York University School of Law. It's called, in the Review of Law and Social Change, it's called The Evidence of Christian Nationalism in Federal Indian Law. And Peter Dorico considers it to be a seminal work, a groundbreaking work that had not been previously written in that manner. And so from there, I just kept refining the information, refining the argumentation. It's been an evolution. There has to be a certain amount of obsessiveness, I guess, for lack of a better word, where you are so desirous of creating the correct expression or the most accurate expression you possibly can. And maybe it's something like composing music. I don't have a musical background at all, but there's always that effort to create the next, I would think, beautiful musical composition. And so it's like that with the music, with the wording, and trying to get the correct wording. There's also a psychological aspect where you have to give yourself permission to say things that others might feel are off or too extreme, or why are you saying it that way? One colleague one time at the United Nations, he said, well, do we have to mention the Holy See? And I'm like, yeah, of course we do. That's what we're talking about here, the Vatican. So, and the concern, well, we don't want to be seen as loons. If that's, you know, so you have to overcome those psychological hurdles. I'm not trying to make light of that. I'm trying to say that that's a significant part of the process. Oh, we might get in trouble if we say these things. And so we'll monitor ourselves, or hold back, or not express it as domination. Well, maybe it's sufficient to say dominion. No, because if you take the word N, the letter N off the word dominion, you have dominio, which means to dominate. And you also have the root word of domination, which is domo in Latin, to subjugate, to subdue, to force into subservience, to tame, to domesticate, to cultivate, and to till. And so you have to put these paradigms together and understand them in a unique way. So I went way too long on that. I apologize.
I love how you tie that in with Christendom and even freedom. I mean, it really makes us look at the meanings of words that way. So, Emily, do you have any others?
Yeah, I have one last question. I mean, I have a lot of questions for you actually, so I'm really excited.
Mm-hmm.
We would love to have you back.
Yes.
But one
Thank you.
final for tonight, at least, is, at the end of the trailer, we heard this bold invitation to join in ending the domination system, all our relations. And I'm just curious if you have any suggestions or any guidance for, our listeners for how we can do that. What are some steps we can take in our own lives?
Well, I think spread the word. Let people know about the movie. Let people know about the book. Let people know about the issue. Let people know about the unique nature of this information and how critically important it is for all life on this planet to understand how we can end patterns of domination and dehumanization against one another, against ecosystems, against life, and figure out how we're going to transition to a reverential basis of life. And the thing with English is that it's kind of an endless loop. More than 60% of English is derived from Latin, which is the Roman Empire language of domination. And there's a way in which that influences all of our thoughts and our behavior. And so what source of information do we have that isn't based on that? Well, original nations' languages. For example, my friend Jamie LeBrake, he talks about the word hauka and kumiai, which is a word, it's a greeting, but it really means may the fire within you burn bright. Or a Cree medicine person who mentioned to me that the word for fire in Cree, it translates to the warmth of a woman's heart. Or in our language, Gishelemiang means the one who created everything with thought. So we understand that the thought, what we think and what we speak is part of the creative, how we create life and create reality. So we have to come together and figure out how we can create reality on the basis of mutual respect and a deep reverence and respect for all forms of life, rather than how to dominate and control so we can accumulate more riches and wealth. And so it has to be a completely different orientation toward life. So the more they can do, the more people can spread the word, assist us. Maybe people want to have us come and give a talk or what have you. That would be most helpful.
Well, we will keep talking about this.
Screening. Yeah.
I would love to see this
of the movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to keep talking about this. So, Emily, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and Stephen, just so I'm aware, Original Free Nations, is that your website?
Yeah, originalfreenations.com. Also, Indigenous Law Institute. I guess if you just type it in as Indigenous Law Institute, it comes up. I don't have.
Well, what I find is if you just
URL.
If you just Google Stephen Newcomb and Doctrine of Discovery, all of this will pop up. You will find a link to his documentary film. You will see Original Free Nations, which is full of articles that he's written about the Doctrine of Discovery and other issues. And we're getting really at the end of this podcast, unfortunately. Do you have anything coming up, books or films that you would like to tell us about very quickly?
Well, it's in process of being produced, but there is a documentary that I'm assisting with on the revitalization of the Lakota language, and Bryant Highhorse and George McAuliffe and Tink Tinker and I are collaborating to work toward a wonderful documentary, which will have part of the doctrine woven into that as well. And it's my contention that as much time, effort, energy, and money should be put into the revitalization of our languages, cultures, and spiritual traditions as were put into the effort to destroy them to begin with. And so that is just so simply logical, but yet unless you say it, nobody knows it. No, nobody would think of it, right?
It's crazy.
But you have native languages now that are in hospice. They're in hospice. Our Lenape people, every single one of our elders that was born into the language as an infant in the language, raised from infancy to adulthood in the language, they're all gone. So what do you do with that? And that's a whole nother conversation.
Well,
but that's one thing. I have a book I'm working on, called
that's great.
Built by
Well, I would urge everybody to read Stephen's books, or you can find videos on YouTube as well, and they're just fascinating topics. And we will have the links in the show notes as well if you look at the Foundry Arts website. Before we say goodbye, I saw you do this in the film, and I just loved it. Would you mind? Well, first of all, tell us what Turtle Island is.
Well, according to some of the Eastern Seaboard nations, there's the origin story that has to do with the turtle and the Earth being formed on the back of a turtle. And so the Turtle Island is the name as a result of that origin story. And it's a common name that you'll hear among some native nations. And so I created a lyric some time ago. My friend Pila Lorno from Hawaii, Kanakamali, man, he said, "Hey, you should create a lyric for the younger generation. Maybe they'll identify with the more readily if you do that." And I didn't know if I could write something of that sort, but I decided to give it a try. And so this is what I created. We are the Turtle Island nations, praying for all our relations, entirely free originally, forever that way we shall rightfully be, rejecting claim discovery. They say they discovered our lands and our lives. We all know that's nothing but lies with a colonial design to dehumanize. You can't discover another nation's home with permission from a pope in Rome and rightfully impose a Capitol dome. Kings, queens, potentates, bearing symbols of church and state, gave a right to dominate. Their ancestors sailed under color of God, divine right to take that was nothing but fraud. We're sustained by our spirituality and our abiding reality. So they've tried to destroy our sacred sites and ceremonial places, but we've held tight. They're never going to erase us from this blue orb of day and night with living waters and sunlight. We pray for all the elements of life. We are the Buffalo nations, praying for all our relations, entirely free originally, forever that way we shall rightfully be, rejecting assumed superiority. We know water is life for everyone. Decolonize your mind.
I absolutely love that. That's so inspiring. This is my highest compliment. If you have a cult, I want to join it. I would.
No cults here, please. Culture, yes. Cults, okay. No.
Well, I'm going to keep reading and watching your things, and I've just learned so much from you. So thank you so much. It's a great honor to have you on here, and we'll definitely talk about when we can have you back and talk about more in depth about the doctrine of discovery and other issues. So
the doctrine of domination. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure. I think he's fascinating. My God, watch the movie. You will be shocked if you watch the movie. It's just a little bit over an hour, so it doesn't take a whole lot of your time, but you will learn a lot. So we're at the end of this. Thank you guys for joining me. I want to tell you about the production company that makes this podcast. It's produced by the Foundry Arts, and the Foundry Arts is a lab committed to artists in music and the performing arts by promoting a more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable cultural landscape in the USA and beyond. You can find out more about their collaborative development projects and programs by visiting thefoundryarts.com. And before we get going, I'd like to say thanks to our wonderful team, Emily, Rob, Rome, Marcy, and Pat, and our newest member, Laura, who's helping us with social media. Our next guest next month, it's our final show of the season, is the great tenor Russell Thomas. And I first met Russell, my God, he was probably about 19 years old, and he was thrown into my class in Aspen. And now he's an internationally famous tenor, and has just been named artist in residence at the Los Angeles Opera. And I know that Russell speaks his mind, so I'm really looking forward to that talk. If you listen to our play out, you'll hear the great Wayne LaValle in the song he wrote with Marie Clements entitled Indian Man, which I love. Mado for listening tonight. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
You got your ancestors inside.